Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Brainy Boomers lecture series. We are very happy that you have joined us today. Thank you so much. First, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the McGill University Research Center in Studies in Aging is located where our work is done on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanyan Kehaka Nation is recognized as the custodian of the lands on waters on which we gather today. Tio Tiake, commonly known as Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many Indigenous peoples. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples we serve within the Montreal community. Um, just a little note about who we are as the McGill Education Committee. In 2007, the McGill University Research Center for Studies in Aging, MCSA Education Committee, started the Brainy Boomers lecture series to suggest practical steps to both improve and maintain brain health, as well as to promote healthy lifestyle choices amongst the most populous generation in history. The MCSA Education Committee was founded in 1996 and has three objectives: identifying education needs of healthcare providers, seniors, caregivers, the public, and developing responses to meet these needs. Two, enhancing the positive image of the aging process for successful aging by addressing stereotypes, myths, and paradigms about aging. And three, dissemination of research on aging. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's guest, and it's Dr. Kate De Medeiros. Thank you for being here today and participating in our lecture series. Dr. De Medeiros is a social gerontologist and professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University in Montreal. Her research is broadly focused on understanding the experience of later life using life story narratives and other qualitative and mixed methods approaches. She has authored and co-authored more than 60 research articles and book chapters, as well as 3 books. Madame De Medeiros est gérontologue sociale et professeure au département de sociologie et d'anthropologie de l'Université Concordia à Montréal. Ses recherches sont largement axées sur la compréhension de l'expérience du troisième âge à l'aide de récits de vie et d'autres approches qualitatives et mixtes. Elle est auteure et co-auteure de plus de 60 articles de recherche et chapitres de livres ainsi que de 3 ouvrages. Dr. Medeiros, nous sommes ravis de vous recevoir aujourd'hui et nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue au Centre de recherche et d'études sur le vieillissement de l'Université McGill. Dr. Medeiros, thank you for being our guest lecturer today, and we welcome you to the McGill University Research Center for Studies in Aging. Thank you so much. Without further ado, enjoy the lecture, everyone.
Thank you. I will just go ahead and share my screen. So as was mentioned, I'm a social gerontologist, which means that what I study is aging, especially the context in which we interpret aging, the social, the cultural, and the historical background. So my degrees are actually in gerontology, although I'm in a department of sociology and anthropology. So what I want to talk about today then is this idea of risk in later life. I want to start out then by thinking first of all about this thing that we call later life and old age. We know that we experience aging, and some people mention that we are aging from the time we're born. So when I think about aging, I think of the cultural construction of meaning that we place to a series of biological processes. And I'm going to come back to this because I'm going to think about the ways that aging is understood oftentimes within societies such as Canada and in the United States. and that will bring me to talk more about this notion of risk and vulnerability. So the discourse that we use to think about aging and to describe aging reinforces a lot of the social positions and expectations. So we use words like vulnerable, for example, which again I'll get into. Um, uh, Other descriptors, those become very value laden and can affect the experience of moving through time. Um, Age is also characterized in the media and other sources as a time of increasing vulnerability and risk. And so we might say, well, yes, as one moves through time, your likelihood of experiencing a chronic disease certainly does increase, with age. However, the degree to which people are vulnerable or at risk sometimes is overstated. We have seen this discourse a lot, certainly. What I'm ultimately wanting to think about is when we take a position of thinking about vulnerability and risk as bad things, we also inadvertently separate the experience from some of the very meaningful experiences that can be derived from risk and vulnerability. And I'm not talking about, extreme risks, jumping out of an airplane, although if that's, what you want to do, then, hey, more power to you. Not something I'm going to do. And I also want to stress throughout that individual preference is key. So I'm making some general observations, but I in no way am suggesting that there's a one size fits all for all people. I think that individual interest and desires must be respected. So I'm not, so I just want to be clear on that because that often comes up as people have, different views of what they consider to be appropriate or inappropriate. So the interesting thing about risk is that when we look at other populations, risk is a very positive thing. So there's just been a series of articles I've seen in the research literature talking about one of the challenges that the current adolescent generation is facing is not enough exposure to risk. So, we know that as people are growing and developing, exposure to risk can be really, really healthy. Risk helps people navigate their sense of self. It helps, with things like gaining a mastery, a sense of control, an understanding of the world. If we use it in a business sense, I mean, we think about, entrepreneurship, which is, really based on risk, taking a chance, putting oneself out there, trying to, afford change in a way that may not be, the most safest route. So I mean, these all seem like good things, but interestingly, when we start applying vulnerability and risk to aging, it takes a very, very different turn. Vulnerability is viewed as a negative. People are positioned as being in need of protection from vulnerability and risk. We think about the ways that even social programs are often devised to minimize, say, negative emotions, things like sadness, crying, keeping things on the positive. So it's interesting, when we switch the populations, we have very different views. And I'm going to kind of dig down a little bit deeper into this social construction of age and why I think that this is the case with the positioning of risk and vulnerability. So aging is here kind of two different views on this thing called age. So one is from Lakoff and colleagues, and they talk about the views of aging as a shared cultural representation. So when you look at how a given culture views people who are considered older or old, you can see how those members are treated and how age is valued or not valued in that particular culture. It often this value becomes conflated then with a sense of reality. So, that the reality of aging is such because this is how aging has always been viewed in a given society. But again, keeping in mind that this is very much of a cultural construct, and in many Western cultures, we inherit a very, very long history of views toward age passed down historically through, philosophy, through history, through Shakespeare, through fairy tales, through other things in a way that makes aging seem like it's an established reality when in fact it's very culturally constructed. This is a quote from a German American Studies professor, Rudiger Kurnow, which I've always found really compelling. He describes aging not as a description, but as a judgment. So he argues that it takes two to age: a person who lacks the attributes of what is considered young, and someone to act on those attributes. And of course, we can see this in different contexts. A person in their 40s may be treated as older by a group of people in their 20s, or people in their 90s may be treated different by people in their 60s. So it's a relational aspect of aging that I think is important to keep in mind. Of course, we know from the literature that people age at very different rates. So this age of 65, which is really meaningless in so many contexts. I'm sure you all know the history of 65. It started actually when Otto von Bismarck first developed the welfare state in the German Republic. Interestingly, his age for eligibility into the pension system was 70. After his death, the age was lowered to 65, and that was an age that was adopted by many countries. Um, the age of retirement eligibility much lower in some countries. In Thailand, it's age 60. So often this official mark into retirement eligibility gets used as a proxy for when someone's considered older, even though 65 is again meaningless, and there's so much more heterogeneity in people as they age than as they're younger. 20-year-olds have a lot in common. 65-year-olds have very little in common given their entire life experience. With that said, chronological age is also a very poor predictor of health outcomes. So yes, people are at increased risk, if you will, of experiencing different types of morbidities with age. However, age 65 is again in and of itself pretty meaningless. We saw age used as a demarcation during the COVID pandemic, and often it wasn't chronological age, but it was the presence of comorbidities along with age that was the real underlying risk factor. And again, great heterogeneity. So people often speak about people in a certain age group as if there's similarities, but again, so many differences. And this is, I think, a point that often gets overlooked by the media and other sources. So now, when we have this cultural construction of age, then there's also the cultural narratives that frame the experience. So I mentioned, the historical context of which we inherit different ideas about age. And a great example of a cultural narrative is the Horatio Alger rags to riches. So I have recently moved from the US to Canada last year, and certainly in American culture, this idea that if you just work hard enough, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps and be successful is a predominant cultural narrative. So that kind of frames this idea of, anyone can do it. It also, though, inadvertently puts individual blame when there are social structures that prevent that from happening. Why didn't you succeed? Well, access to education and other things come into play. But these cultural narratives shape a lot of what we think. And so it is with aging too. So we can think of a lot of cultural narratives that describe aging. Um, Unfortunately, many of these are negative. We see images in the media that talk about things like a silver tsunami, which is just a horrible kind of image, right? It just focuses on the negative. It overlooks the all of the benefits of a longevity economy, and the fact that people are enjoying much longer life on average in much better health. So, but these things shape how we think about aging, and so is the narrative of vulnerability, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Now, I don't know if this is something that you're all familiar with or not, but a lot of the Western idea of aging, it comes from these interesting life course drawings, schemas, posters that were popular in the 1800s. There's a really interesting evolution of how we went from a circle of life to a rising and descending staircase. Um, but I'll spare you all that detail. But just to say that this was a very, very common image throughout Europe. It was a way to kind of know your place. Where should you be in your life course? And so, and there are these exist for men and for women. The interesting thing is if you notice on the top of the drawing, so this is typically age 50. So this is considered the time at which it's the prime of life. You're on top, you have the most responsibilities. There's usually a proximity to God. This is a Christian topology. You're closest to God at that point, right in the center. And this is when you were at your highest peak, right? So everything else is leading up to that. Everything else, of course, is downhill from there. So we get this image of that, once we hit this prime, we start to become less than and we start to decline. Different responsibilities according to this based on these ages. And the interesting thing is the way that this is shaped, the proximity to God changes. So, you become less responsible because you're a less responsible person. So, an adolescent isn't as accountable as, say, an adult, an older person as well. So we get this positioning of life stages with this diagram that still has repercussions for us today. I draw from the work of theorist Hayam Hazan, and this was done in conjunction with his graduate student, where he talks about and makes an argument that what we know about aging really comes from the perspective of middle age, and that middle age positions itself as an authority on older age. So that middle age as a construct, as a point of life, really sets the tone for what's appropriate and acceptable to do in younger life and in later life. And this, again, has a bearing on how we think about things like risk and vulnerability because of this authority. Um, he talks about how, we look at the people who from middle age, when we look toward older age, there's a certain kind of othering, right? It's different. Older people are different than the middle-aged person. So in that difference then become things like judgment, going back to Rudiger Kernau's, there's this sense of you're not me, you're somebody else, therefore I make assumptions about you. It's that notion of the gaze, so we've seen this in feminist studies where we think of the male gaze, where women are portrayed in certain ways because it's from the perspective of what men think women should be. And so is Hazan and Raz's argument that we think about older age that way because it's how it's been constructed from a middle-aged standpoint of who gets privileged and who doesn't, and who has authority and who doesn't. And so I'll show you a little bit more about what I mean. Um, again, looking at some of the headlines, and I didn't include, of course, there are a lot of headlines right now with the presidential election and the debate over whether President Biden should run for re-election again. Um, but you can think about some of the messages that get sent and that get delivered via the media. Usually it's in a very negative sense. There's often this portrayal that somehow older people are taking the resources of younger people, which actually is not true, and many people have demonstrated this. But it sets up this, again, this position and this judgment about what it means to be older and how older age is valued. Now, this comes from Hazan and Raz also. So, what they're basically saying is that then middle age has this position on the top of the pyramid, this prestige, of which we see youth and older age as equal positions on the pyramid, meaning that there's a lot of similarities between how old age is viewed and how youth is viewed to some degree. Of course, youth are often, they're reaching towards maturity. So there's a sense of this, reciprocity as, moving someone up, whereas older age is positioned as a time of decline. And so often a lot of resources, things aren't attributed to people in that position of older age because of views of what's important. Um, they also argue that because of this position, that the stories of youth are forward looking. So when we talk to kids, we might ask things like, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you think you'd like to do in the future? We're forward looking, we're forward planning. We don't typically ask children, tell me about your life story. What's your life been like? We typically don't do that. It's not always, not an absolute. But with older people, we often don't ask about futures. So we do focus on the past. Tell me about what it was like when you were younger. What was this like? There's this interest in maybe, have you lived through historical events or things like that, but often not forward looking. I should add that I've spent many years working with various creative groups with older people, typically in writing using different literary genres. And that's the one thing that people have often told me. No one asks me about my future. People assume that I live in my past. And that's kind of, we can see that in the model that the schema that Hazan and Raz have put forward. They also argue that because of this, we tend to think of old age as a similar parallel to young age, such that the social spaces that are given to older people are often the same spaces given to children. So if we think about intergenerational programming, many programs focus on pairing older people with children. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Many people like that pairing. However, you don't often see the intergenerational programs with using generations that aren't children. So, you don't see a lot of, say, even college students or, budding professionals. Certainly some exist, but that's not typically the case. So Hazan and Raz argue that it's because of this idea of the social spaces. Now, middle age, they say, can do anything. So middle age can look forward, it can look backward. The stories from middle age can encompass anything. But again, there are these certain social spaces where youth and older age are relegated to occupy. And if you look on this ascending and descending staircase, we can see that, these ages occupy the same position in this kind of schema. And this, has formed our modern conception of the life course. We think about when we do life course research about these public milestones that people achieve. We look at age, period, and cohort. We try to make comparisons, but we have in our minds this idea of this ascending, descending staircase, including the notions of decline. And this is just an overlay. So, Hazan and Raz weren't actually referring to this in their article, but interestingly, it fits really well when we apply it to this kind of schema of later life. And again, if we look at the life course perspective, we think about these milestones that people make. We look about at how these have changed over time. Right now, there's an argument that there is an elongation of the life course, that people are taking a lot longer to leave this idea of young adulthood into middle adulthood. People are marrying, if they do marry at all, much later. People are starting families, if they do at all, much later. People spending more time being educated before entering the workforce, or even leaving the workforce to pursue different avenues of education as opposed to the linear life course that we used to see. So again, this kind of just to sum, this is this idea of this cultural construction of aging, middle age as this position of authority, and this inaudibility of later life, in that the focus is on the past, often not the present. So this brings me to vulnerability. So vulnerability typically, has these connotations of, needing help, of being in need, of frailty, which is often used synonymously with vulnerable, but frailty is its own concept and its own kind of state of being. When we look at the etymology of vulnerability, it comes from Latin vulnare, wounding, and from the noun vulnus, or wound. It's generally defined as the susceptibility of being hurt or wounded, or being in the state of being harmed and attacked. Um, Certainly being unduly taken advantage of. So, of course, various groups are labeled as vulnerable in order to give certain protections from, abuse, from, injury, from being taken advantage of, or all those other things. But there's a kind of a new discourse that's emerging that's really questioning what are some of the negatives of being labeled as vulnerable. So if you're vulnerable, there's this certain inference that you are not able to, say, be on your own, to be, independent, that you need certain kinds of protections, that there's a certain paternalistic quality that goes along with that. While there's certainly situations we can all think of where it is essential that someone gets protection, where somebody is in a state of vulnerability, that the challenge comes when entire groups of people are labeled as vulnerable despite the individual differences, so despite that heterogeneity. And so we can often see this with aging, that certainly there are some people who, as they age, they become more vulnerable to various things. Those are most likely going to be rooted in, say, socioeconomics, education, health status, cognitive status, other things. And that certainly doesn't apply to all older people, because again, people age very differently at very different rates. So now there are other people who argue that vulnerability is actually a very good thing, because it's what we call persistent vulnerability. We're all vulnerable. We're humans. We're fragile beings. We get injured very easily. We are susceptible to many things. Bodies are subject to harm, and that we like to think of ourselves as being independent, but because of our persistent vulnerability, we are very dependent, and that's a really good thing. So it's this idea that we shouldn't push back about against being vulnerable, because we are vulnerable. We should embrace that. Caregiving should be something that's not viewed as a burden, but it should be viewed as something that, we're helping each other. And so that's one way that this kind of notion is trying to be reframed. Um, then this selective vulnerability. So again, the idea that, instead of couching an entire group as being vulnerable, looking at the particular circumstances of who is made vulnerable and what are those social conditions, and can those social conditions be addressed in a way that addresses the vulnerability. Because what can happen is if someone is deemed as vulnerable, and if there is a protection and overprotection, it can prevent people from realizing their full potential. So I can give you an example of, say, somebody living in a care facility. Let's say that you've got, diminished health. On the one hand, yes, you want to be protected from things like COVID or other terrible things that can happen. But on the other hand, as we saw with the lockdowns, some people were isolated to a point where, because they were deemed vulnerable, they were not allowed to experience other things that would make their life worth living. So that's the balance that I'm really shooting for here. So is it being vulnerable or being made vulnerable? At what point are the conditions that one is asked to live in or where one is housed, what's making that person vulnerable or not? Again, we saw this a lot during the COVID pandemic. We saw families being separated, and hindsight's great, and we can look back and talk about what should have been different. But I think the point is in thinking forward and planning ahead, thinking about where's the line between choice, between protection, and between engaging in things that are meaningful. I have argued elsewhere that most people, if given a choice between existing or having 10 good minutes, would choose 10 good minutes over simply just the expanse of time without meaning. Again, the other issue with vulnerability is that it challenges the notion of active citizenship, and so it becomes, when people are put in a vulnerable class, they often are positioned as being frail, dependent, a problem to be solved, not a group to be empowered, and so. A lot of what I'm talking about is, again, that positioning of old age as that decline, as not having a social space, and as this emphasis on, lack of citizenship and disempowerment, some of which we can see echoed in the media in some of those, media reports. This is a great example, I think, of this positioning. So I see articles like this. So what to do when elderly parents refuse help? Um, Not knowing the situation of this given person, I think it's pretty paternalistic to suggest that all older parents are in such need. Certainly, there are some people who are, but again, when we position older people as not being good decision makers across the board, that can be problematic. Obviously, there are people who do need help, people who may have some cognitive issues or health issues or things like that. But again, this protectionist mode. I work with someone who is only 60, and her children have started to take such an approach with her. Gee, should you be driving? Should you be doing this? What we do know from a lot of the literature on ageism is that but being treated as someone who's incapable of has an effect on one's self-assessment, on one's self-esteem, and people can internalize that. So this idea of viewing someone as vulnerable who's not vulnerable, treating them as vulnerable, can actually lead to vulnerability. Now, but there's this other positive, wonderful aspect of vulnerability that we often don't think about, and that's that willingness to, to show some weakness, to open oneself up, to take a risk. Um, Arguably, again, when we think about this in the context of different ages, these things are viewed very positively. Go out there, give it a shot. What's the worst that's going to happen? Go to this new social event, or go do some online dating, or whatever that might be. Generally viewed as positive, but again, not typically in the context of aging. And that brings me to risk. So risk, we think of, the susceptibility to harm, often used in conjunction with vulnerability. So what is your risk of falling? What is your risk of contracting COVID? We think of those things. But if we go back and look at risk as a concept developing over time, it used to mean to dare, to venture, to sail before the wind, this very positive aspect. I have a colleague, Bill Randall, from Professor Emeritus from University of St. Thomas, and his big thing right now is thinking about aging as adventure and trying to change the narrative from aging as something that one does or experiences passively and in a protectionist mode to going out there and seeking new adventures, however small. Again, this doesn't mean you're traveling around the world necessarily, but it may mean embarking on new opportunities of learning, of social engagement, or things that might be a little bit outside of your comfort zone that push you into this sense of achieving something meaningful. This is just a great quote from a paper by Kathleen Woodward, an age studies scholar, who talks about how we are so risk averse at this point that we're afraid of everything, and how, again, that can really restrict what people are willing to do or engage in. So are we afraid of any exposure? If we walk outside, my goodness, the terrible things that can happen. And when that happens, and when people completely remove themselves from risk, again, we get the backlash, and that is, are people still able to participate in things that are meaningful? And how can we make sure that meaningful engagements can occur, even if we're trying to mitigate the worst risks? Uh, so again, leading to this risk aversion, how do we move forward if we think negatively about risk and vulnerability? How can we shift the narrative from just a blank, we got to get rid of all risks, to one where people can engage? An anecdote when I used to work in a dementia research facility was that, the best way to prevent people from falling is not to let them stand up, which of course sounds horrible, right? But you could reduce the risks if nobody was allowed to walk around. But then, of course, what kind of life would that be if people couldn't engage in the things that they wanted to? Um, so this risk intolerance, where does that leave us when we think about aging societies? How can we embrace risk in a way that is beneficial and meaningful, based on choice again? Um, I'd like to present, excuse me, just some examples from some work I've done with a writing workshop, and I'll do that in a minute, where interestingly, a lot of my colleagues were trying to reduce risk, like, oh gosh, don't bring up sad things. Don't, we want everybody to be happy. We want everybody to focus on, these wonderful aspects of life. Don't bring up anything that's going to upset anyone. But I would argue that meaning is derived from risky situations and from when we make ourselves vulnerable. So it's beyond that point of existing, but it's aboutness, this idea that we have put ourselves at risk, that we can fail, that we derive the most meaning. I've also had people tell me, who live in very, very nice retirement communities, that they find that their time isn't anchored by anything. That what they were the most frustrated with is that although they were busy, what they were doing didn't seem to mean anything. So again, it kind of drilling into the importance of meaningfulness as opposed to, say, busyness. Now, again, it's going to depend on your personal preferences. Some people like, gardening. I do not like gardening. I'm a terrible gardener. That would be a horrible thing for me to do. But these ideas of meaning. So this is a schema that some of my Dutch colleagues came up with on how to achieve meaningful moments. So it's this sense of participating in something that provides coherence, or this sense of being connected to something larger than oneself. And that could be a community, it could be another individual, it could be the world, again, up to individual preference. a future orientation. So it's not about doing something just to do it, but it's doing something for the future, whether it's creating something, planting something, working toward climate change, whatever. Significance, there's an evaluative component. So it's not just something to do just to do, but there's something involved that allows one to think about the significance of what one does. And then it results in a path of purposeful action. So again, not simply checking a box, but engaging. And there are many, many ways that people could certainly can do this. This idea of achieving these many meaningful goals, there's again emerging research that talks about how that risk and how that vulnerability and that meaning making can actually be really good for brain health. And I'm not going to drill into that. I'm not certainly not a neuroscientist, but it's really positive. And of course, it makes intuitive sense that um, that being able to push yourself beyond your comfort zone, not too much. You don't want to be, in a state of stress, could potentially be good. So these meaningful moments, deeply felt, enlightened, uh, uh, transforming, deeply processed. So something that's more than the cursory spending time. And this again is some from work from my Dutch colleague Gerben Westerhal, where they've actually done a schema in the context of looking at life reviews with people. So I want to just give you one quick example then of some meaning making that I worked on for years. So I did these series of writing workshops with older people where my big interest was in not in getting people to tell stories about their past per se, but seeing how genre affected what stories get told and not told. So we went through a course of starting with first person memoirs, writing letters, then poetry, then third person stories where people saw themselves as someone else, just as a way to get outside of themselves. And people found it very jarring and very scary. This is a poem that one of the participants wrote. So she was a paraplegic. She was in an airplane accident in Alaska and lost the use of her legs. And I think that this is really a great example of a very meaningful encounter, which in some context, some people would have avoided talking about, the obvious, her having to say goodbye to the use of her legs, and in this kind of creative form. Just another example also happens to be a poem, easier to put on screen, about a person coming to realize and question who she was now that her father had died, and feeling like, I'm an orphan now. Am I just old? And what does that mean? I'm nobody's child. So again, examples of people getting outside of themselves. And, again, some people would love this, some people would hate it. But what I found in the process of these groups is that people did make connections with each other, did develop networks. They did, through this act of vulnerability and risk that they got to control, they could write whatever they wanted. There was a certain sense of sharing. And that was really the impetus of why I got interested in this to begin with, seeing that what happened when these people came together. So overall, I'm just advocating to really think about moving beyond risk as negative, about protecting against vulnerabilities as a blanketed statement, but strategizing moving forward of how we could really think about what are productive vulnerabilities, and I don't mean productive in that it yields some, you know, money related, whatever, tangible. I mean, personally productive or constructive, I guess. And how can that relate to meaning? And how can we think about aging as a time for these types of endeavors? So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I certainly open to questions or discussion. And if you want to reach me later, here's my email. I'm also on Twitter, so don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you.